The sobs echoing through the cramped cabin of Flight 892 were so raw, so utterly broken, that even the most hardened passengers couldn't help but glance towards seat 22C with a mixture of pity and uncomfortable embarrassment. Katherine Cat Reeves sat hunched over like a wounded animal, her shoulders shaking with each ragged breath, tears streaming down her face as she clutched a crumpled military photo in her trembling hands. To everyone around her, she looked like just another damaged veteran who couldn't handle civilian life. But what they didn't know was that her tears were about to save the President of the United States, and her broken facade was the most sophisticated cover operation in modern military history. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. The Boeing 737 was packed to capacity on this Tuesday morning flight from Phoenix Sky Harbor to Washington Dulles, filled with the usual mix of business travelers, tourists, and government workers heading back to the nation's capital. The recycled air carried the familiar sense of coffee, stale pretzels, and that indefinable airplane smell that somehow managed to be both sterile and suffocating at the same time. Outside the small oval windows, the Arizona desert stretched endlessly below, a vast expanse of brown and gold that seemed to mirror the emptiness that Kat was so convincingly portraying. She had been crying for nearly 20 minutes now, ever since takeoff, and the sound was beginning to grate on the nerves of her fellow passengers. The woman in 22B kept shooting her sideways glances, clearly debating whether to say something or request a seat change. The businessman in 22A had already put on his noise-canceling headphones and turned up his music, though his obvious irritation was written across his face like a billboard advertising his impatience with other people's emotional displays. "Ma'am, are you okay? Is there anything I can get you?" Rachel Martinez, the lead flight attendant, approached with the kind of professional compassion that airline employees were trained to display. Her uniform was immaculate, her smile practiced but genuine, and her eyes held the weary patience of someone who had dealt with every possible passenger crisis during her 8 years in the skies. Kat looked up at her with red-rimmed eyes, the photograph clutched against her chest like a shield. "I'm sorry," she whispered, her voice barely audible above the drone of the engines. "I'm so sorry for bothering everyone. I can't stop thinking about them." She held up the photograph with a shaking hand, revealing the image of 3 soldiers in desert camouflage, their arms around each other's shoulders, smiling at the camera with the kind of carefree joy that only comes from brotherhood forged in combat. Rachel's expression immediately softened. She had dealt with grieving passengers before, but there was something particularly heartbreaking about this young woman's pain. "Were they your friends?" she asked gently, crouching down in the aisle to be at eye level with Kat.
"My unit," Kat managed between sobs. "We were in Afghanistan together. 3 tours. They were like my brothers." Her voice cracked on the last word, and fresh tears spilled down her cheeks. "I was supposed to be with them when it happened. If I hadn't gotten sick that day, if I had been there—" She trailed off, unable to finish the sentence, her grief too raw and immediate for words. What Rachel couldn't see, what none of the passengers could detect, was the micro earpiece hidden deep in Kat's left ear, so small and sophisticated that it was virtually undetectable even to security scanners. Through this device, she was receiving a constant stream of intelligence updates from Operations Silent Eagle's command center, located 3 stories beneath the Pentagon. Her handler's voice was a whisper of static and urgency. "Shadow 7, we have confirmation. The package is airborne. Air Force One departed Andrews 14 minutes ago. The window is closing." Kat's response was invisible to the casual observer, a slight adjustment of her position in the seat that activated a pressure-sensitive transmitter sewn into the fabric of her jacket. Her message was transmitted through a series of micro-movements that looked like the restless fidgeting of a distraught passenger, but actually conveyed detailed tactical information. Copy control, visual confirmation of 3 potential hostiles. Section 2 appears clean. Beginning Phase 2 surveillance. "Can I get you some water, maybe some tissues?" Rachel offered, her hand reaching for the call button that would summon additional assistance if needed. The other passengers were starting to notice the commotion, their conversations quieting as they turned their attention to the unfolding drama in row 22. "That would be nice, thank you," Kat replied, her voice still thick with tears. As Rachel walked toward the galley, Kat used the moment of privacy to conduct what appeared to be an emotional breakdown, but was actually a systematic reconnaissance of her surroundings. Her eyes, though red and watery, were cataloging every detail with the precision of a trained operative: the positions of the emergency exits, the location of potential weapons, the behavioral patterns of every passenger and crew member within her line of sight. The man in seat 18D had been checking his watch every 37 seconds since takeoff, too regular to be natural anxiety. The woman in 15F was reading the same page of her magazine for the 4th time while her eyes constantly scanned the cabin. Most telling of all was the supposed businessman in 8A who claimed to be sleeping, but whose breathing pattern was all wrong, too controlled, too alert for someone actually at rest. These weren't random passengers. These were operatives, and their presence on this specific flight was no coincidence. Kat's mission briefing had prepared her for this possibility, but seeing the reality of it unfold made her pulse quicken despite her years of training. The intelligence had been accurate. Someone was planning to use Flight 892 as a weapon against Air Force One, and she was the only thing standing between success and catastrophe. "Here you go, sweetie." Rachel returned with a small bottle of water and a packet of tissues, her voice gentle and maternal. "Take your time. There's no rush." Kat accepted the items with a grateful nod, using the exchange to slip a nearly invisible listening device onto the underside of Rachel's service tray. The device was no larger than a grain of rice, powered by kinetic energy, and capable of transmitting audio for up to 6 hours. As Rachel moved through the cabin serving other passengers, she unknowingly became a mobile surveillance platform, carrying Kat's eyes and ears into every conversation and interaction. "I'm sorry for causing such a scene," Kat said loudly enough for the nearby passengers to hear, playing perfectly into her cover as an emotionally unstable veteran. "I know this is uncomfortable for everyone. I thought I was ready to travel again, but being up here, in the sky, it reminds me too much of the transport flights we used to take." The businessman in 22A finally removed his headphones, his expression a mixture of annoyance and grudging sympathy. "Look, lady, I get it. War is tough, but some of us are trying to work here, and your crying is making it really difficult to concentrate." His tone was harsh, but not entirely unkind, the voice of someone who wanted to help but didn't know how and was frustrated by his own inadequacy.
"Bradley, show some compassion," said the woman in 22B, whose name tag identified her as Nicole Foster, a nurse from Phoenix, heading to a medical conference in Washington. "Can't you see she's suffering?" Bradley Hartman, according to the passenger manifest that Kat had memorized during her mission preparation, was a defense contractor with connections to several major military suppliers. His presence on this flight might be legitimate, but it was also convenient cover for someone with less innocent intentions. Kat filed this information away while maintaining her performance as a broken veteran seeking sympathy from strangers. "I'm not trying to be heartless," Bradley continued, his voice carrying the particular brand of entitlement that came from a lifetime of privilege. "But there are resources for this kind of thing: therapy, support groups, medication. Crying on an airplane doesn't solve anything, and it makes everyone else uncomfortable." The words hit their target perfectly. Kat's sobs intensified, becoming more audible and more distressing. Other passengers began shifting in their seats, some looking toward the disturbance with concern, others with obvious annoyance. The cabin crew exchanged glances, clearly debating whether intervention was necessary. What none of them realized was that Kat's increased emotional display was actually a signal to her handler, confirming that she had identified potential threats and was ready to move to the next phase of her mission. Her crying provided perfect cover for the slight hand movements that activated additional surveillance equipment hidden throughout her clothing and personal items. "Maybe I should ask to be moved to a different seat," Kat said through her tears, loud enough to be heard by anyone listening. "I don't want to ruin everyone's flight." The offer was calculated to elicit sympathy while also giving her a reason to move around the cabin, allowing her to get closer to her surveillance targets. "Nonsense," said Nicole firmly, shooting a disapproving look at Bradley. "You stay right where you are. Anyone who has a problem with someone grieving for their fallen comrades can find their own seat." Her defensive Kat was passionate and immediate, the response of someone who understood loss and had no patience for those who didn't. As the debate continued around her, Kat allowed herself a moment of professional satisfaction. Her cover was working perfectly. She appeared to be exactly what she claimed, a damaged veteran having an emotional crisis at 30,000 feet. Meanwhile, she was systematically gathering intelligence on what appeared to be a sophisticated terrorist operation designed to target the most protected aircraft in the world. The photograph in her hands, the one that had triggered her supposed breakdown, was real. Those men had been her brothers in arms, and they had died in service to their country. But they hadn't died in Afghanistan, as her cover story suggested. They had died 6 months ago during a classified operation that officially never happened, their sacrifice known only to a handful of people with the highest security clearances. Their deaths had led to the intelligence that put her on this plane, following a thread of revenge and conspiracy that reached into the highest levels of government. Someone was going to pay for what happened to her team, and someone was going to answer for the threat against Air Force One. But first, she had to maintain her cover just a little longer, play the broken veteran just a little more convincingly, until the moment came to reveal who she really was and what she was truly capable of. The tears continued to flow, each one a perfectly crafted piece of a deception that would soon save lives and expose traitors. Katherine Reeves sat in seat 22C, crying for her fallen brothers, while preparing to honor their memory in the only way that mattered, by completing the mission, no matter the cost. By the time the beverage service began 40 minutes into the flight, Kat's emotional display had evolved from uncomfortable background noise to the primary source of cabin-wide tension. Her sobs had settled into a rhythm that was somehow more disturbing than the initial outburst, a steady, broken sound that seemed to seep into every conversation and make concentration impossible for anyone within earshot. The passengers were beginning to choose sides, and Bradley Hartman was leading the charge for those who had run out of patience. "This is absolutely ridiculous," Bradley announced loudly, making no effort to keep his voice down as he twisted in his seat to address the growing audience of frustrated travelers. "I paid good money for this ticket, and I shouldn't have to listen to someone having a complete mental breakdown for 3 hours." His tone carried the authority of someone accustomed to getting his way, the voice of a man who had never been denied anything he wanted and saw no reason to start now. The comment sparked a murmur of agreement from several nearby passengers. The businessman in 14C nodded emphatically while typing aggressively on his laptop, as if each keystroke was a vote of support for Bradley's position. The elderly woman in 19B made a disapproving clicking sound with her tongue, shaking her head in obvious annoyance at what she perceived as a public display of weakness. "Maybe she should have thought about that before getting on an airplane," added Jennifer Walsh, a sharp-faced woman in her 40s who worked for a consulting firm in Washington. Her voice carried the crisp efficiency of someone who had built a career on solving problems by eliminating the inconvenient elements. "There are medications for anxiety, therapy for trauma, support groups for veterans. This kind of behavior is just attention-seeking." Kat looked up from her tear-stained photograph, her eyes wide with hurt and confusion. "I'm sorry," she whispered,
her voice breaking with what sounded like genuine shame. "I didn't mean to. I thought I was ready to fly again, but being up here just brings it all back." She gestured helplessly at the window where the desert had given way to farmland stretching endlessly toward the horizon. "Well, maybe next time you should drive," Bradley shot back, his comment earning a few uncomfortable chuckles from passengers who were more concerned with their own comfort than with basic human decency. Or at least warn people that they're going to be trapped in a flying therapy session. What none of them could see was the cold calculation behind Kat's tears. Each cruel comment was being recorded by sophisticated listening devices she had placed throughout the cabin, their voice recognition and behavioral assessment automatically uploaded to Operation Silent Eagle's analysis division. The passenger in 8A, the one pretending to sleep, had shifted position 3 times during Bradley's outburst, subtle movements that suggested he was more alert than he appeared. The woman in 15F had stopped pretending to read her magazine entirely, her eyes now openly scanning the cabin as if looking for something specific. Most interesting of all was Bradley himself. His reaction was too strong, too coordinated, as if he was deliberately trying to isolate Kat and make her a target of group hostility. A legitimately annoyed passenger would have simply requested a seat change or asked the flight crew to intervene. Instead, Bradley was orchestrating a public shaming campaign that seemed designed to break her down completely. Through her earpiece, Kat heard her handler's voice providing real-time analysis. Shadow 7, facial recognition confirms Bradley Hartman has connections to 3 defense contractors currently under investigation for foreign intelligence ties. His presence on this flight may not be coincidental. Maintain cover and continue surveillance. "I understand everyone's frustration," Rachel Martinez said, approaching the growing confrontation with the diplomatic skills that came from years of managing airborne conflicts. "But let's all try to show a little compassion here. This young lady is clearly going through something difficult, and we're all stuck together for the next 2 hours. Maybe we can find a way to make this work for everyone." "The way to make this work," Bradley replied, his voice rising with indignation, "is for her to control herself like an adult. This isn't a battlefield. It's a commercial flight with paying customers who deserve a peaceful journey." He gestured dramatically at the other passengers, as if he were their elected representative in this crisis. Several heads nodded in agreement. The mob mentality was building exactly as Bradley had intended, turning what should have been a minor inconvenience into a full-scale passenger revolt against Kat's presence. The cruelty was systematic, calculated, and completely effective at making her appear isolated and vulnerable. "You know what I think?" said Marcus Webb, a heavy-set man in his 50s who claimed to work in government procurement. His voice carried the particular breed of meanness that came from someone who enjoyed other people's suffering. Real soldiers deal with their problems privately.
The accusation hit like a physical blow. Kat's sob caught in her throat, and for a moment, her mask of vulnerability became absolutely genuine. The suggestion that she was exploiting her service, and by extension, the sacrifice of her fallen teammates, was more painful than any physical torture she had endured during her training. "How dare you," Nicole Foster said, her voice shaking with anger as she rose from her seat to confront Marcus directly. "How dare you question this woman's service or her sacrifice? Do you have any idea what people like her go through to keep people like you safe?" "I'm just saying," Marcus replied with a shrug that suggested he couldn't care less about the pain he was causing. "Maybe if she can't handle being around other people, she shouldn't be on a plane. There are facilities for people with these kinds of problems." The comment sparked a new wave of cruel laughter from Bradley's growing coalition of supporters. They were feeding off each other's cruelty now, emboldened by the group dynamic that made individual compassion seem weak and foolish. Kat had become their common enemy, the target that allowed them to bond over their shared superiority and impatience. What they didn't understand was that their behavior was providing Kat with invaluable intelligence about the real threat on this flight. The passengers who were quickest to attack her, who seemed most invested in isolating her and breaking her down, were also the ones whose behavioral patterns suggested training and coordination. This wasn't random passenger hostility. It was a systematic effort to neutralize what they perceived as a potential threat to their operation. Through her hidden surveillance network, Kat was mapping the entire conspiracy in real time. Bradley's aggressive leadership of the verbal assault, Marcus's calculated cruelty, the woman in 15F's constant visual surveillance, the fake sleeper in 8A's unnatural alertness. All of it painted a picture of a coordinated team working to create chaos and confusion aboard Flight 892. "Maybe we should take up a collection," suggested another passenger, a thin woman with a cruel smile who seemed to be enjoying the spectacle. "Send her to one of those fancy PTSD retreats where she can cry all she wants without bothering normal people." The comment triggered a fresh round of tears from Kat, but these tears served a dual purpose. They maintained her cover while also allowing her to activate a series of micro cameras hidden in her clothing, each one no larger than a pinhead, but capable of recording high-definition video that would later be used to identify every conspirator aboard the aircraft. "This is getting out of hand," Rachel said, firmly, her professional demeanor finally cracking under the pressure of managing what was quickly becoming an ugly mob scene. "I'm going to have to ask everyone to return to their seats and keep their voices down. We still have more than an hour left in this flight, and we all need to coexist peacefully." "Or what?" Bradley challenged, his voice carrying a note of threat that seemed disproportionate to a disagreement with a flight attendant. "You're going to have us arrested when we land for expressing our opinions about a passenger who's disrupting everyone's flight?" The challenge was subtle but unmistakable. Bradley was testing the crew's authority and willingness to enforce order. It was the kind of probe that trained operatives use to assess security responses and identify weaknesses in their target's defenses. Kat filed this information away while continuing to play the role of helpless victim. "I'm so sorry," she said again, her voice barely a whisper as she hunched lower in her seat. "I never wanted to cause any trouble. Maybe I should try to sleep, try to be quieter." The performance was perfect, broken, apologetic, completely non-threatening. She appeared to be exactly what a group of sophisticated terrorists would want their victims to be: isolated, demoralized, and completely focused on their own emotional crisis rather than on the threat developing around them. But behind her red eyes and tear-stained cheeks, Kat was methodically preparing for war. She had identified at least 5 potential hostiles, mapped their positions and behavioral patterns, and confirmed that Flight 892 was indeed the launching pad for an attack on Air Force One. The only question now was whether she could maintain her cover long enough to determine the full scope of their operation before being forced to reveal her true capabilities. As the verbal abuse continued around her, Kat clutched her photograph tighter and allowed herself to think about her fallen teammates. They had died for their country, and she would honor their sacrifice by ensuring that no one else would die on her watch. The passengers who were mocking her suffering had no idea that they were about to witness the resurrection of one of the most dangerous operatives in the world. The broken veteran in seat 22C was about to become their worst nightmare, and they were too busy enjoying their cruelty to see the storm that was gathering right in front of them.
The turbulence hit without warning as Flight 892 crossed into Oklahoma airspace, sending passengers lurching against their seatbelts and causing coffee cups to rattle in the galley. For most travelers, it was just another minor inconvenience in the already tense atmosphere of the cabin. For Kat, it was the perfect cover for what she needed to do next. As the plane bucked and swayed, she allowed herself to be thrown forward just enough to drop the photograph she'd been clutching, sending it skittering across the aisle toward the feet of Agent David Quinn. Quinn sat in seat 24A, wearing the unremarkable uniform of federal anonymity, navy blazer, khaki pants, and the kind of forgettable face that made him perfect for his role as an air marshal. He had been watching the confrontation in Road 22 with the professional detachment of someone trained to identify and neutralize threats. But Kat's accidental movement brought her into his immediate sphere of concern. "Oh no," Kat gasped, scrambling to unbuckle her seatbelt despite the captain's warnings to remain seated. My picture. I can't lose that picture. It's all I have left of them. Her voice cracked with desperate emotion as she pushed past Nicole Foster and stumbled into the aisle, creating the exact kind of disruption that would normally trigger immediate intervention from air security. Quinn's hand moved instinctively toward his concealed weapon, but he stopped when he saw Kat crawling on her hands and knees, tears streaming down her face as she searched for the scattered photograph. To him, she looked like exactly what she appeared to be, a traumatized veteran having a complete breakdown 30,000 feet above the ground. What he couldn't see were the micro movements of her fingers as she retrieved the photo, each gesture activating another piece of surveillance equipment hidden throughout the cabin. "Ma'am, you need to return to your seat immediately," Quinn said, his voice carrying the quiet authority that marked him as more than just another passenger. "The pilot has the seatbelt sign on for good reason." Kat looked up at him with red-rimmed eyes, clutching the recovered photograph against her chest like a lifeline. "I'm sorry, I'm so sorry. I just couldn't bear to lose it. They're all gone, and this picture is the only proof they ever existed." Her voice was small and broken, but her eyes were cataloging every detail of Quinn's positioning, his alertness level, and the slight bulge under his left armpit that confirmed her suspicions about his true role. "I understand," Quinn replied, his tone softening slightly as his training in crisis management kicked in. "But right now, the safest place for you is in your seat with your seatbelt fastened. Can you make it back there on your own, or do you need help?" As Kat allowed Quinn to help her back to her seat, she used the physical contact to plant one final listening device. This one attached to his jacket with an adhesive so sophisticated it would dissolve within 6 hours, leaving no trace of its existence. The device would give her access to any communications Quinn might receive through his own federal channels, potentially providing early warning if the conspiracy extended into law enforcement. "Thank you," she whispered as she settled back into 22C, her performance of grateful vulnerability so complete that even Quinn seemed moved by it. "I don't know what's wrong with me today. I used to be so strong, so capable. Now I can barely function in public." The comment was calculated to reinforce her cover while also fishing for information about Quinn's background and training. His response would tell her whether he was a routine air marshal or someone with more specialized capabilities who might pose a threat to her mission. "Military service changes people," Quinn said quietly, his voice carrying the weight of personal experience. "Sometimes the things that make you strong in combat make it harder to deal with everyday situations. There's no shame in struggling with the transition." Bingo. Quinn's response confirmed that he had military experience, which meant he was potentially more dangerous than a standard federal agent, but also more likely to be sympathetic to her apparent plight. This information would be crucial if she needed to neutralize him later without causing unnecessary harm to someone who was genuinely trying to serve his country. From her earpiece, she received an urgent update from her handler. "Shadow 7, we have new intelligence. Air Force One's flight path has been altered due to weather. New arrival time at Joint Base Andrews is 1347 hours. Your window is closing faster than anticipated." Kat's response was invisible to everyone watching, a slight adjustment in how she held the photograph that activated a pressure-sensitive transmitter. Her message was clear: intelligence gathered, threats identified, ready to move to active phase. But as she settled back into her performance as a broken veteran, something unexpected happened. The cruelty she had endured from her fellow passengers was beginning to affect her in ways that her training hadn't prepared her for. The comments about exploiting her military service, the suggestions that she was weak and unstable, the casual dismissal of her pain, all of it was hitting closer to home than she had anticipated.
The truth was that Kat really had lost teammates in combat. Not in Afghanistan, as her cover story suggested, but in a classified operation that had gone wrong due to intelligence failures and bureaucratic incompetence. Their deaths haunted her in ways that she rarely allowed herself to acknowledge, and playing the role of a grieving veteran was forcing her to confront emotions that she typically buried beneath layers of professional detachment. Through her surveillance network, she could hear Marcus Webb talking quietly to the woman in 15F, their conversation providing crucial intelligence about the conspiracy's timeline. "The package should be in position within the next 30 minutes, Marcus was saying, his voice so low that only Kat's sophisticated listening devices could pick up the words. "Once we have confirmation that the primary target is airborne, we move to phase 2. The woman, whose passenger manifest identified her as Elena Kozlov, supposedly a tourist from Denver, nodded and checked her watch. "What about the federal agent? He's been watching everything. "Quinn? He's not a problem. His job is to protect the passengers, not to stop what we're really here to do. By the time he realizes what's happening, it'll be too late for anyone to intervene." The conversation confirmed Kat's worst fears. This wasn't just about hijacking Flight 892. The plane itself was somehow going to be used as a weapon against Air Force One. The timeline was accelerating, and she was running out of time to gather the intelligence she needed while maintaining her cover. Bradley Hartman chose that moment to renew his verbal assault, apparently emboldened by the successful humiliation campaign he had orchestrated earlier. "You know what really bothers me about this situation?" he announced loudly, making sure his voice carried throughout the cabin. "It's the fact that we're supposed to feel sorry for someone who clearly can't handle the responsibilities of adult life." His words sparked a new round of cruel laughter from his supporters, but this time, Kat noticed something different in their responses. The timing was too perfect, too coordinated. These weren't random passengers getting caught up in mob mentality. They were trained operatives using psychological warfare to isolate and neutralize what they perceived as a potential threat. "Some people join the military because they can't succeed in the real world," Bradley continued, his voice dripping with contempt. "And when that doesn't work out either, they fall back on playing the victim and expecting everyone else to take care of them." The accusation was so far from the truth that it was almost funny. Kat had joined the military because she was recruited by Operation Silent Eagle while still in high school, identified as having the rare combination of intelligence, physical capability, and psychological stability that made for elite special operations work. She had more training, more combat experience, and more real-world capability than everyone else on the plane combined. But the personal attacks were serving their intended purpose. They were making her angry. And anger, even justified anger, could cloud judgment and lead to mistakes that would compromise her mission and potentially cost lives. Through her earpiece, she heard her handler's voice providing both intelligence and emotional support. Shadow 7, Psychological Profile on Bradley Hartman, shows history of manipulation and control tactics. He's attempting to provoke an emotional response that would compromise your cover. Stay focused on the primary mission. Kat took a deep breath and forced herself to sink deeper into her performance, allowing the tears to flow more freely while her mind remained coldly analytical. She was learning more about the conspiracy with every passing minute, and the intelligence she was gathering would be crucial for stopping whatever attack was being planned against Air Force One. But she was also learning something about herself, that even the most sophisticated training couldn't completely shield her from the human cost of the work she did. The loneliness, the constant deception, the need to hide her true capabilities behind masks of weakness or normalcy, all of it was taking a toll that she was only beginning to understand. The Broken Veteran Act was becoming less of an act and more of a reflection of parts of herself that she rarely allowed to surface. And that realization was both terrifying and strangely liberating, because it meant that when the time came to drop the mask and reveal her true capabilities, the transformation would be even more shocking to everyone who thought they knew who she was. As Flight 892 continued its journey toward Washington, Kat prepared for the moment when Katherine Reeves, the broken veteran, would disappear forever, replaced by the most dangerous woman on the plane.
The revelation came through her earpiece at exactly 11:47 a.m., delivered in the controlled voice of her handler at Operation Silent Eagle's command center. "Shadow 7, we have confirmation. Air Force One is carrying Package Diamond. Repeat, Package Diamond is aboard the primary target." The code phrase sent ice water through Kat's veins.
Package Diamond was the classified designation for the president's 12-year-old daughter, traveling with her father to a youth summit in Geneva. This wasn't just an assassination attempt against the commander-in-chief. It was an attack that would target a child. Kat's grip tightened involuntarily on her photograph, the only outward sign of the rage building inside her as the full scope of the conspiracy became clear. Through her network of listening devices, she had been monitoring conversations throughout the cabin for the past hour, and the intelligence she was gathering painted a picture of an operation far more sophisticated and deadly than anything in her mission briefing. Marcus Webb, the supposed government procurement officer, was coordinating the attack through a series of coded text messages sent on an encrypted satellite phone that bypassed all standard aircraft communication restrictions. "The bird is in the nest," he texted to an unknown recipient, his fingers moving with the practiced efficiency of someone who had done this many times before. Package confirmed at 37,000 and climbing. Window opens in 43 minutes. Elena Kozlov, the fake tourist from Denver, was monitoring Air Force One's flight path through a sophisticated tablet disguised as an e-reader. The device showed real-time tracking of multiple aircraft, including the president's plane and at least 6 other military aircraft that were part of the aerial convoy protecting it. Her expertise with the technology suggested training that went far beyond anything available to civilian terrorists. Most disturbing of all was Bradley Hartman, whose aggressive leadership of the psychological warfare against Kat now revealed itself as systematic preparation for what was coming next. He wasn't just a cruel passenger who enjoyed tormenting vulnerable people. He was a trained operative whose job was to ensure that anyone who might interfere with their operation was already broken down and neutralized before the real attack began. "The federal agent is still a problem," Bradley said quietly into a concealed microphone during his third trip to the bathroom in 40 minutes. "Quinn keeps watching everything, and he's positioned to intervene if we move too early. We need a distraction that will draw him away from the operational area." The response came through his earpiece, loud enough for Kat's sensitive listening equipment to detect. "Use the veteran. She's already unstable and causing disruptions. Push her to a complete breakdown, force Quinn to deal with her, then initiate phase 3 while he's distracted." Kat's blood pressure spiked as the callous calculation behind their plan became clear. They weren't just using her emotional display as cover for their own activities. They were planning to exploit her apparent mental health crisis to manipulate a federal law enforcement officer into abandoning his protective duties. The sheer ruthlessness of it was breathtaking, even by the standards of international terrorism. Through her surveillance network, she began picking up fragments of the larger plot. The attack on Air Force One wasn't going to be a direct assault. It was going to be a technological hijacking using military-grade electronic warfare equipment hidden in the cargo hold. Flight 892 had been specifically chosen because its flight path would bring it within range of the president's aircraft at the exact moment when Air Force One would be most vulnerable during its approach to European airspace. "The payload is armed and ready," she heard Elena whisper into her communication device. "Remote activation in 37 minutes, synchronized with the primary target's descent protocol. Once we trigger the electromagnetic pulse, their defensive systems will be completely compromised." The pieces clicked together with terrifying clarity. They weren't planning to crash Air Force One directly. They were going to disable its electronic countermeasures and communication systems, leaving it defenseless against surface-to-air missiles that were probably already in position along the flight route. It was an elegant plan that would look like a technical failure or a mechanical malfunction, with no obvious connection to the commercial flight that had actually triggered the attack. Preparing and narrating the story took us a lot of time, so if you're enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story. But there was still something missing from the intelligence picture. Flight 892 was carrying over 200 passengers, and Kat had identified only 4 confirmed operatives among them. For an operation this sophisticated, there had to be more assets involved, which meant either some of the apparent civilians were also part of the conspiracy, or there were additional threats that she hadn't yet identified.
Her answer came when she noticed the pattern in the bathroom visits. Over the past hour, 17 different passengers had made trips to the lavatories at the rear of the aircraft, But instead of following the normal in-and-out pattern, they were spending extended periods in the confined spaces. More telling, they were entering with standard carry-on items and emerging empty-handed. They were assembling something in the bathroom, most likely the final components of the electromagnetic weapon that would be used against Air Force One. The realization meant that nearly 10% of the passengers on Flight 892 were actively involved in the conspiracy, making this one of the largest and most complex terrorist operations ever attempted on American soil. Through her earpiece, she heard her handler's urgent voice, providing real-time intelligence updates. Shadow 7. Satellite imagery shows 3 surface-to-air missile sites along Air Force One's flight path. All sites appear to be civilian construction projects with legitimate permits, but thermal imaging reveals military-grade weapon systems hidden beneath the equipment. You are looking at a coordinated international operation with resources that suggest state-level sponsorship. The scope was staggering. This wasn't just terrorism. It was an act of war disguised as a technical failure, with Flight 892 serving as the unwitting weapon that would assassinate the president and his daughter. The passengers who were mocking her pain and dismissing her suffering had no idea that they were about to become accessories to the murder of America's first family. Kat's training kicked in with cold, mechanical precision. She had identified the primary threats, understood the operational timeline, and confirmed the target. Now she had to make the most difficult decision of her career: when to drop her cover and reveal her true capabilities. Move too early, and she might miss additional conspirators or fail to gather crucial intelligence about their support network. Move too late, and Air Force One would be defenseless when the attack came. The decision was made for her when she overheard Bradley coordinating the final phase of their psychological operation against her. "It's time to push her over the edge," he said into his concealed microphone. "I want a complete breakdown, something dramatic enough to require medical intervention. That will give us the cover we need to move the federal agent away from his post." What Bradley didn't understand was that pushing Katherine Reeves over the edge was about to unleash something far more dangerous than a traumatized veteran having a mental health crisis. He was about to discover that the broken woman in seat 22C was actually one of the most lethal operatives in the world, and his psychological warfare tactics were about to backfire in the most spectacular way possible. As Bradley stood up and began walking toward her seat with the confident stride of a predator approaching wounded prey, Kat made her final preparations. Her hands moved in subtle patterns that activated the last of her hidden equipment, sending encrypted signals to Operation Silent Eagle that would trigger immediate military response protocols. Air Force One would be warned, the missile sites would be targeted for elimination, and every asset in the European theater would be mobilized to protect the president. But first, she had to deal with the immediate threat aboard Flight 892. The conspirators had made one fatal error in their planning. They had assumed that their psychological warfare would break her down instead of making her stronger. They were about to learn that the most dangerous person on any battlefield was someone who had nothing left to lose and everything to fight for. Bradley reached her row and looked down at her with the cold smile of someone about to deliver a crushing blow. "You know what I think about people like you," he said, his voice loud enough to carry throughout the cabin. "I think you're exactly the kind of weak and pathetic individual who gives real veterans a bad name." Kat looked up at him with tear-filled eyes, her expression a perfect mask of vulnerability and pain. But behind that mask, Katherine Reeves was calculating angles of attack, identifying pressure points, and preparing to show Bradley Hartman exactly what a real veteran was capable of when properly motivated. The broken woman in seat 22C was about to disappear forever, and in her place would emerge the nightmare that had been hunting them from the moment they stepped aboard Flight 892.
Bradley Hartman's final assault came with the calculated cruelty of someone who had built a career on breaking people down. He positioned himself directly in front of Kat's seat, blocking her view of the aisle and creating the kind of intimidating physical presence that was designed to make her feel trapped and helpless. Behind him, she could see Marcus Webb and Alana Kozlov moving into position, their casual movements masking the coordination of trained operatives preparing for the final phase of their operation. "You want to know what's really pathetic about this whole situation?" Bradley said, his voice rising to ensure maximum public humiliation. "It's watching a grown woman use her military service as an excuse for completely falling apart in public. Real soldiers don't cry like babies when things get difficult." The verbal attack was precisely timed. Through her surveillance network, Kat could hear Alana coordinating with someone on the ground. T-18 minutes to target acquisition, all systems armed and ready for electromagnetic deployment. The federal asset is still in position, but psychological pressure on the distraction element is reaching critical threshold. Agent Quinn had indeed risen from his seat, his trained instincts recognizing that the situation in row 22 was escalating beyond normal passenger conflict. His hand moved instinctively toward his concealed weapon, but his attention was focused entirely on what appeared to be a mental health crisis rather than the real threat developing around him. "Ma'am, I think you should come with me," Quinn said, stepping into the aisle with the authority of federal law enforcement. "We can find you a quieter place to collect yourself, maybe get you some medical attention if you need it." It was exactly what the conspirators had planned. Quinn's protective instincts were leading him directly into their trap, removing the only law enforcement presence in the operational area just as they prepared to activate the weapon that would doom Air Force One. The timing was perfect, the manipulation complete, and the attack was now inevitable. Unless Katherine Reeves stopped pretending to be broken. "You know what I think?" Bradley continued, his voice dripping with contempt as he leaned closer to her seat. "I think some people join the military because they're too weak to succeed in the real world, and when that doesn't work out either, they fall back on playing the victim card for the rest of their pathetic lives." The personal attack hit its mark, but not in the way Bradley intended. Instead of breaking her down further, his words triggered something deep in her training, a combination of righteous anger and cold professional calculation that her instructors at Operation Silent Eagle had called controlled fury. It was the mental state that turned elite operatives into unstoppable forces of nature. Kat looked up at Bradley with tears still streaming down her face, but something had changed in her eyes. The defeated, vulnerable expression was still there, but underneath it was something else, something that made Bradley take an involuntary step backward, even though he couldn't consciously identify what he was seeing. "You're absolutely right," Kat said quietly, her voice barely audible above the drone of the engines. "Some people do use their military service as an excuse for weakness." She wiped the tears from her cheeks with the back of her hand, the gesture somehow managing to be both vulnerable and threatening at the same time. "But you made one critical mistake in your assessment, Bradley." The use of his name sent a chill through the cabin. Passengers don't typically know each other's names unless they've been formally introduced, and Bradley Hartman had never told anyone on the plane what to call him. The realization that this broken woman somehow knew his identity was like a splash of ice water on his confidence. "My name is Katherine Reeves, Lieutenant Katherine Reeves, Operation Silent Eagle, operational designation Shadow 7. And you, Bradley, are about to learn the difference between someone who served their country and someone who betrays it." The transformation was instantaneous and terrifying. The hunched shoulders straightened into perfect military posture, the tear-stained face hardened into the cold mask of a professional killer. The trembling hands steadied into instruments of precision violence. In the space of a single sentence, the broken veteran disappeared completely, replaced by one of the most dangerous operatives in the world. But it was what came next that would be remembered by every survivor of Flight 892 for the rest of their lives. Kat reached into her jacket pocket and pulled out what appeared to be an ordinary cell phone, but as she held it up to her mouth, her voice carried the kind of authority that stopped conversations and commanded absolute attention from everyone within earshot. "Night Watch 77 Alpha,
I am Lieutenant Katherine Reeves, Operation Silent Eagle, Authentication Code, Thunderstorm 79 Delta. Air Force One is under imminent attack. Repeat, Air Force One is under imminent attack. Initiating emergency countermeasures now.
The response was immediate and overwhelming. Warning lights began flashing on the aircraft's communication panel. The pilot's voice came over the intercom with barely controlled urgency. Ladies and gentlemen, we have received emergency instructions from air traffic control. All passengers must remain seated with seatbelts fastened. Flight attendants, please secure the cabin immediately. But the real response came from outside the aircraft. Through the small windows, passengers could see military jets appearing in formation around Flight 892, their sleek forms cutting through the sky with deadly precision. F-22 Raptors from the nearest airbase had been scrambled within minutes of CAT's authentication code, their mission to escort the compromised civilian aircraft away from Air Force One's flight path. Agent Quinn's training kicked in with perfect clarity. The federal agent who had been prepared to escort a traumatized veteran to a quiet corner for medical attention suddenly found himself face to face with a classified military operation of the highest priority. His hand moved away from his weapon as he realized that the greatest threat to his passengers wasn't the woman having an emotional breakdown, it was everyone who had been tormenting her. "Jesus Christ," Quinn whispered, his voice carrying the awe of someone who had just witnessed the impossible. "You're not a veteran having a breakdown. You're an active operative on a classified mission." Kat nodded, her eyes never leaving Bradley's face as she watched the color drain from his features. The arrogant defense contractor who had been so confident in his psychological warfare was beginning to understand that he had just revealed himself and his entire operation to one of America's most elite intelligence assets. "Bradley Hartman," Kat said, her voice carrying the cold authority of someone with the power of life and death. "Marcus Webb, Ilana Kozlov, and approximately 14 other foreign operatives currently aboard this aircraft. You are all under arrest for conspiracy to commit acts of terrorism against the United States government." The cabin erupted into chaos as the full scope of what was happening became clear to the civilian passengers. The people they had assumed were fellow travelers were actually international terrorists, and the woman they had been mocking was the only thing standing between them and a catastrophic attack on the President of the United States. Through her earpiece, Kat heard the rapid-fire updates from her handler. "Shadow 7, Air Force One has been warned and is executing evasive maneuvers. All 3 missile sites have been targeted for immediate neutralization by drone strikes. F-22s are in position to escort your aircraft to Andrews Air Force Base for emergency landing. Outstanding work, Lieutenant." But Kat's attention was focused on the immediate threats aboard Flight 892. Bradley was reaching for something concealed in his jacket, probably a weapon or a detonator for backup explosives. Marcus Webb was moving toward the rear of the aircraft where the electromagnetic weapon was hidden, and Ilana Kozlov had produced a satellite phone and was frantically trying to coordinate with her handlers on the ground. The broken veteran who had been crying in seat 22C was gone forever. In her place stood Lieutenant Katherine Reeves, and she had work to do. "Ladies and gentlemen," she announced to the terrified passengers, her voice carrying over the chaos with the unmistakable authority of command. "My name is Lieutenant Katherine Reeves, and I am a United States military intelligence operative. The people who have been verbally abusing me for the past 2 hours are international terrorists planning to assassinate the President of the United States. I need everyone to remain calm, stay in your seats, and let me do my job." She turned her attention back to Bradley, who was still frozen in place, his hand halfway to his concealed weapon. "As for you, Bradley, or whatever your real name is, I suggest you put your hands where I can see them and pray that I'm in a forgiving mood today." The hunt was about to begin, and the predators were about to discover what it felt like to become prey.
The silence that followed Kat's revelation lasted exactly 3 seconds, long enough for the full weight of the situation to sink into the minds of everyone aboard Flight 892. Then, chaos erupted with the fury of a Category 5 hurricane hitting a coastal town without warning. Passengers who had spent the last 2 hours mocking a broken veteran suddenly found themselves face to face with the terrifying reality that they had been sharing their flight with international terrorists and one of America's most classified military assets. Bradley Hartman's hand froze halfway to his concealed weapon as the mathematical certainty of his situation became clear. The woman he had been psychologically torturing was not only a highly trained operative, she had been systematically gathering intelligence on his entire network while appearing completely helpless and defeated. Every cruel comment, every coordinated attack, every whispered conversation with his co-conspirators had been recorded and analyzed by someone who specialized in dismantling terrorist operations. "I wouldn't reach for that if I were you," Kat said conversationally, her voice carrying the kind of casual menace that made Bradley's blood turn to ice water. "You're already looking at life imprisonment for conspiracy to commit terrorism. Adding assault on a federal officer to your charges seems unnecessarily stupid, even for someone who thought psychological warfare against a Phantom Division operative was a good tactical decision." Agent Quinn had drawn his weapon and was scanning the cabin with the professional alertness of someone whose entire worldview had just been turned upside down. The federal agent who had been preparing to escort a traumatized veteran to safety was now coordinating the security response to what appeared to be the most sophisticated terrorist operation ever attempted on American soil. "Lieutenant Reeves," Quinn said, his voice tight with controlled adrenaline, "how many hostiles are we dealing with here?" 17 confirmed. Primary coordination team of 4, weapons assembly team of 6, communications specialists numbering 3, and backup security assets totaling 4. All passengers in seats 8A, 15F, 18D, 21B, 23C, 26A, 28F, 31B, 33D, 35A, 37C, 39F, 41B, 43D, 45A, 46C, and 48F are to be considered armed and extremely dangerous. The precision of her intelligence assessment sent a chill through the civilian passengers as they realized how completely they had been infiltrated. Nearly 1 in 12 people on their flight was an foreign operative, and the only person who had detected the conspiracy was the woman they had been systematically abusing for the past 2 hours. Marcus Webb made his move with the desperate fury of someone who knew his mission had been compromised beyond recovery. The supposed government procurement officer lunged toward the rear of the aircraft where the electromagnetic weapon was hidden, his hands reaching for the activation switch that would still allow them to complete their attack on Air Force One, even if their cover was blown. He made it exactly 4 steps before Kat intercepted him. The transformation was so swift and violent that most passengers missed the actual mechanics of what happened. One moment, Kat was sitting calmly in seat 22C, explaining the tactical situation to Agent Quinn. The next moment, she was airborne, her body moving with the fluid precision of someone who had spent years perfecting the art of close-quarters combat in confined spaces. Her first strike took out Marcus's left knee with surgical precision, a perfectly placed kick that shattered the joint and sent him crashing into the seatbacks with a scream of pain that echoed through the cabin. Her second strike was a nerve cluster attack to his neck that paralyzed his right arm and left him gasping for breath on the floor of the aisle. "Marcus Webb," she said calmly, standing over his writhing form while barely breathing hard from the exertion. "Real name Dmitry Volkov, Russian GRU operative with specialization in electronic warfare and infrastructure sabotage. You've been under surveillance by Operation Silent Eagle for the past 18 months. The casual revelation that she knew his true identity and operational history sent a wave of panic through the remaining conspirators. Elena Kozlov was frantically trying to activate some kind of dead man switch on her satellite phone, while the operatives scattered throughout the cabin began reaching for concealed weapons with the desperation of cornered animals. "I wouldn't reach for that if I were you," Kat said, announced to the cabin in general, her voice carrying clearly over the chaos. "Agent Quinn, if you would be so kind to cover the forward section, I'll handle the rear. Any passenger who reaches for a concealed weapon will be considered a hostile target and neutralized accordingly."
What followed was less of a fight and more of a systematic demonstration of why Operation Silent Eagle operatives were considered the apex predators of the intelligence world. Kat moved through the cabin like a force of nature, appearing behind each terrorist before they could complete their desperate attempts to salvage their mission.
The operative in seat 26A, a woman who had been posing as a grandmother traveling to visit family, found herself unconscious before she could draw the ceramic knife hidden in her knitting bag. The supposed businessman in 35A discovered that his concealed pistol was useless when his weapon hand was broken in 3 places before he could clear leather. The fake college student in 43D learned that his training in hand-to-hand combat was woefully inadequate against someone who had been killing professionally since she was 19 years old. Each takedown was executed with mathematical precision and minimum necessary force. Kat wasn't interested in revenge or displaying her capabilities for theatrical effect. She was systematically removing threats to civilian lives while preserving intelligence assets for interrogation. Every movement was calculated to neutralize without killing, to incapacitate without causing permanent damage to individuals who would need to be questioned extensively about their support networks and operational planning. "Jesus Christ," whispered Nicole Foster, the nurse who had defended Kat against Bradley's verbal attacks. "How is she doing this? She was crying 10 minutes ago." "And that's what we call operational cover," Agent Quinn explained, his own weapon trained on the remaining uncaptured operatives while Kat worked her way systematically through the cabin. "The best intelligence operatives are the ones you never suspect until it's too late to matter." Through her earpiece, Kat was receiving constant updates from her handler. Shadow 7, drone strikes have neutralized all 3 surface-to-air missile sites. Air Force One is safely clear of the operational area and continuing to its destination under heavy escort. The President and Package Diamond are secure. But even as the immediate threat to Air Force One was eliminated, Kat knew that her work on Flight 892 was far from over. The electromagnetic weapon hidden in the rear cargo area was still armed and potentially dangerous to the aircraft itself. The communications equipment being used by the terrorists could contain intelligence about other operations or sleeper cells. And most importantly, at least 4 of the conspirators were still unaccounted for and potentially armed with backup weapons or explosives. Elena Kozlov made her final desperate play as Kat approached her seat, pulling what appeared to be a hand grenade from her carry-on luggage. The ceramic casing was designed to pass through security scanners, and the explosive payload was more than sufficient to breach the aircraft's hull and kill everyone aboard. "Stay back," Elena screamed in accented English, her finger poised on the activation pin. "I will kill everyone on this plane before I let you take me alive." Kat stopped exactly 6 feet away from Elena's seat, her posture relaxed and non-threatening, despite the weapon pointed in her direction. To the terrified civilian passengers, it looked like a standoff between a terrorist with a bomb and an operative who had finally met her match. What they couldn't see was the micro-movement of Kat's left hand, activating a device that had been hidden in her watch band since the beginning of the flight. The electromagnetic pulse was localized and precisely calibrated, just powerful enough to disable the electronic fusing mechanism in Elena's grenade, without affecting the aircraft's own systems. Elena Kozlov. Real name Natasha Petrov, former Spetsnaz operator turned freelance terrorist. Your grenade has been electronically neutralized, your communications equipment has been compromised, and your entire network has been identified and targeted for elimination. Elena's eyes widened in disbelief as she pulled the activation pin, and nothing happened. The grenade that should have killed everyone in a 12-foot radius was now nothing more than an expensive paperweight, its sophisticated electronic systems fried by technology that officially didn't exist in any government inventory. "Now," Kat continued, reaching out to pluck the useless weapon from Elena's frozen grasp, "let's discuss how cooperative you're going to be during your interrogation." As the last of the active threats was neutralized, Agent Quinn surveyed the cabin with something approaching awe. 17 international terrorists had been systematically identified, tracked, and captured by a single operative who had spent most of the flight appearing to have an emotional breakdown in seat 22C.
Lieutenant Reeves, he said, holstering his weapon as the immediate danger passed. I've been in federal law enforcement for 15 years, and I've never seen anything like what just happened here. Kat looked around the cabin at the passengers who had spent the morning mocking her apparent weakness, then back at Quinn with the slightest suggestion of a smile. Agent Quinn, what you just witnessed was a standard Tuesday for Operation Silent Eagle. The only difference is that usually nobody lives to remember it happened. The broken veteran was gone forever, replaced by the most dangerous woman any of them would ever meet. And for the first time since takeoff, Flight 892 was truly safe.
With the immediate threats neutralized and 17 terrorists secured throughout the cabin, Kat's mission entered its most critical phase. The electromagnetic weapon hidden in the cargo hold was still armed and potentially unstable. The communications equipment scattered throughout the aircraft contained intelligence that could lead to other terrorist cells, and somewhere among the remaining passengers might be additional operatives who had managed to avoid detection during her initial surveillance. Agent Quinn, Kat said, her voice carrying the authority of someone accustomed to coordinating complex operations under extreme pressure. I need you to establish a security perimeter around the detained operatives while I sweep the aircraft for additional threats. None of them should be considered unconscious until confirmed by medical personnel, and several are likely carrying suicide devices. Quinn nodded, his 15 years of federal law enforcement experience telling him that Lieutenant Katherine Reeves operated on a level far beyond anything in his training manual. What about the civilians? Some of them look like they're going into shock. The civilians are actually the key to completing this operation, Kat replied, scanning the cabin with eyes that missed nothing. They've been unwitting witnesses to the largest terrorist conspiracy ever attempted on American soil, and their testimony will be crucial for identifying additional sleeper cells and support networks. She turned her attention to the passengers who had spent the morning tormenting her, her expression neutral, but her voice carrying an edge that made them sink lower in their seats. Ladies and gentlemen, I know this has been traumatic, but I need your help to ensure that everyone on this aircraft gets home safely. Over the past 2 hours, you've all observed the behavior of people you now know were international terrorists. I need you to think carefully about any unusual interactions, strange conversations, or suspicious activities you might have witnessed. Nicole Foster, the nurse who had defended Kat against Bradley's attacks, raised her hand tentatively. Lieutenant, I saw the man in 18D, one of the ones you captured. He was texting someone repeatedly, but he was holding his phone at a weird angle, like he was trying to hide what he was typing. Excellent observation, Kat replied, making a mental note to prioritize the examination of that particular device. Anyone else notice unusual communication patterns? The woman in 26A, said an elderly passenger from the middle section, the one who was pretending to be a grandmother. She kept checking her watch, but not like someone worried about being late. More like she was counting down to something. Each observation was adding pieces to a puzzle that painted an increasingly disturbing picture of how thoroughly Flight 892 had been compromised. The level of coordination and planning required for an operation of this scope suggested resources and support networks that went beyond typical terrorist capabilities. This was state-sponsored warfare disguised as civilian air travel. Through her earpiece, Kat received an urgent update from her handler. Shadow 7, preliminary analysis of intercepted communications, indicates this operation was designated Iron Eagle by hostile intelligence services. You're looking at a joint operation between at least 3 different nations, with backup plans that may still be in play. The revelation that this was a multinational conspiracy explained the sophisticated planning and extensive resources, but it also meant that neutralizing the immediate threat aboard Flight 892 was only the beginning of a much larger intelligence operation. Each captured terrorist was potentially a source of information about other planned attacks against American targets. I need to access the cargo hold, Kat told Captain Robert Mitchell, the pilot who had emerged from the cockpit once the immediate danger was contained. The electromagnetic weapon they were planning to use against Air Force One is still armed and potentially dangerous to this aircraft. Captain Mitchell, a veteran of 23 years with the Air Force before joining commercial aviation, looked at the chaos in his passenger cabin with the expression of someone trying to process the impossible. Captain, I've flown combat missions in 3 different theaters, but I've never seen anything like what just happened on my aircraft. How do we handle something like this? Very carefully, Kat replied, pulling a device from her jacket that looked like a cross between a smartphone and a military scanner. The device hidden in your cargo hold is probably using a timer or remote activation system. I need to access it directly to determine whether it can be safely disabled or if we need to consider emergency landing procedures. As she moved toward the rear of the aircraft, she continued her systematic intelligence gathering. The detained terrorists were beginning to regain consciousness, and their reactions to captivity would provide additional information about their training, their operational priorities, and their potential value as intelligence assets.
Marcus Webb, whose real name was Dmitry Volkov, was the first to fully regain awareness of his situation. The Russian operative looked around the cabin with the cold calculation of someone assessing his options for escape or resistance. But his expression changed when he realized that every one of his fellow conspirators had been captured or neutralized. "Katherine Reeves," he said in accented English, his voice carrying grudging respect mixed with professional curiosity. "I have heard stories about Operation Silent Eagle, but I assumed they were propaganda designed to frighten field operatives. It appears I was incorrect in that assessment." "Dmitry," Kat replied conversationally, not bothering to look at him as she examined the structural plans of the aircraft on her scanner. "Your intelligence services have been tracking Phantom Division operations for years, but you made one critical error in your operational planning. You assumed we were reactive rather than proactive." The Russian's eyes narrowed as he processed the implications of her statement. "You knew about Iron Eagle before we initiated the operation?" "We've been tracking Iron Eagle for 8 months, Kat confirmed, finally turning to face him with a smile that contained no warmth whatsoever. "Your communication security was adequate, your operational security was professional, and your cover identities were nearly perfect, but you made the mistake of targeting Air Force One while the president's daughter was aboard." The revelation that Operation Silent Eagle had been monitoring their conspiracy from the beginning sent a chill through not just Dmitry, but every conscious terrorist in the cabin. They had walked into a trap so sophisticated that they hadn't even realized they were being hunted until the moment Katherine Reeves revealed her true identity. "Package Diamond changes the operational parameters," Kat continued, her voice carrying the weight of absolute authority. "When foreign intelligence services threaten the president's family, Phantom Division doesn't just respond, we eliminate the threat permanently and completely." Agent Quinn, who had been listening to the exchange while maintaining security over the detained operatives, felt a chill run down his spine. The casual way Lieutenant Reeves discussed eliminating entire intelligence networks suggested capabilities and authorities that went far beyond anything in the Federal Law Enforcement Handbook. Yelena Kozlov, the former Spetsnaz operator who had tried to detonate a grenade in the passenger cabin, was the next to regain consciousness. Her first words upon awakening were in rapid Russian, apparently trying to activate some kind of emergency communication protocol with her handlers. "Your communication devices have been compromised," Kat informed her calmly. "Every message you've sent since boarding this aircraft has been intercepted and analyzed by our technical specialists. Your support networks are already being rolled up as we speak." The psychological impact of learning that their entire operation had been monitored from the beginning was devastating to the captured terrorists. They had believed they were executing a perfect plan against an unsuspecting target, only to discover that they had been walking into an elaborate trap designed to capture their entire network. Through the aircraft's communication system, Kat received confirmation that her assessment was accurate. "Shadow 7, this is Control. Based on intelligence gathered from intercepted communications, simultaneous operations are underway against terrorist support cells in 14 different countries. Iron Eagle has been completely compromised." But even as the larger conspiracy was being dismantled, Kat's immediate priority remained the safety of everyone aboard Flight 892. The electromagnetic weapon in the cargo hold was still potentially dangerous, and until she could examine it directly, there was always the possibility that it contained a dead man's switch or automatic activation system that could endanger the aircraft. "Captain Mitchell," she said, returning to the cockpit area, "I need you to contact Andrews Air Force Base and request priority landing clearance. This aircraft needs to be on the ground within the next 30 minutes, and will need a full hazardous materials team standing by to deal with the weapon system in your cargo hold." "Lieutenant," Captain Mitchell replied, his voice tight with controlled tension,
What exactly are we dealing with down there? My crew needs to know if we're flying a potential bomb." Kat's expression was grim as she considered the possibilities. "Captain, what you're carrying is sophisticated enough to disable the electronic systems of the most protected aircraft in the world. Until I can examine it directly, we have to assume it's sophisticated enough to bring down a commercial airliner if someone gets desperate enough to use it." The hunt was far from over, and the most dangerous part of the mission was still ahead of them.
The cargo hold of Flight 892 was a maze of luggage, freight containers, and what appeared to be standard shipping equipment. But Kat's trained eyes immediately identified the anomalies that marked the location of the electromagnetic weapon. Hidden within a container labeled as medical supplies was a device that represented the cutting edge of electronic warfare technology, sophisticated enough to disable the defensive systems of Air Force One from a distance of nearly 50 miles. "This is more advanced than anything in our intelligence files," Kat murmured into her throat microphone as she examined the weapon system through her scanner. The device was roughly the size of a large briefcase, but its internal components suggested engineering capabilities that were years ahead of known terrorist technology. "Control, I'm looking at hardware that indicates state-level military development, possibly Chinese or Russian advanced research divisions." Her handler's voice crackled through the earpiece with barely controlled urgency. "Shadow 7, Air Force One is beginning its descent into European airspace. If that weapon activates during their approach phase, even our F-22 escort won't be able to protect them from ground-based missiles. You need to neutralize that device immediately." The electromagnetic weapon was connected to a sophisticated timing system that had been calculating Air Force One's flight path with mathematical precision. According to the display, the device was scheduled to activate in exactly 11 minutes, perfectly timed to disable the president's aircraft during its most vulnerable approach phase, when electronic countermeasures were critical for detecting and defeating incoming missiles. But disconnecting the weapon wasn't as simple as cutting wires or removing a power source. The device contained multiple fail-safe systems designed to prevent tampering, including what appeared to be a dead man's switch that would trigger immediate activation if the containment field was breached incorrectly. Even worse, the weapon was connected to the aircraft's own electrical system, drawing power from Flight 892's engines to charge the electromagnetic pulse that would doom Air Force One. "Captain Mitchell, I need you to prepare for emergency power reduction. In approximately 8 minutes, I'm going to need you to cut all non-essential electrical systems to prevent this weapon from reaching full charge." "Lieutenant," Captain Mitchell's voice replied with the strain of someone trying to maintain professional calm while facing a situation far beyond his training. "Cutting power at altitude will compromise our navigation systems and communications. Are you certain this is necessary?" "Captain, if this weapon reaches full activation, it will kill the President of the United States and his 12-year-old daughter," Kat replied with the blunt authority that came from someone who had dedicated her life to preventing exactly this kind of catastrophe. "I'd say that justifies some inconvenience to our flight systems." Through her surveillance network, she could monitor the reactions of the detained terrorists as they realized their operation was being systematically dismantled. Dmitry Volkov was attempting to communicate with his fellow operatives through a series of coded hand signals, apparently trying to coordinate some kind of backup plan, even while restrained and under guard. "Dmitry," Kat called out without looking away from the weapon system, "whatever you're planning, I should mention that I've been fluent in Russian tactical sign language since I was 16. Your backup plan involves activating a secondary device hidden in seat 33D, but Agent Quinn disabled that particular surprise about 20 minutes ago." The Russian operative's face went pale as he realized the extent to which his operation had been compromised. Not only had Operation Silent Eagle anticipated their primary weapon system, but they had identified and neutralized contingency plans that even some of his fellow terrorists didn't know existed. "How long have you been watching us?" Dmitry asked, his voice carrying a mixture of professional respect and personal defeat. "Since you first started planning Iron Eagle 18 months ago. Your operational security was good, but not good enough to hide from someone who specializes in finding needles in haystacks."
As she worked to disarm the electromagnetic weapon, Kat's earpiece provided real-time updates on the broader operation. Shadow 7, this is Control. Drone surveillance confirms that all 3 missile sites along Air Force One's flight path have been completely neutralized. Additional sites in Romania and Poland have been identified and are currently being destroyed by NATO special forces. The President and Package Diamond are secure.
But even as the immediate threat to Air Force One was being eliminated, Kat knew that her mission aboard Flight 892 was entering its most critical phase. The electromagnetic weapon was more sophisticated than anticipated, and disarming it required techniques that pushed the boundaries of even her extensive training in explosive ordnance disposal. "Agent Quinn," she called out, her voice steady despite the complexity of the work she was performing, "I need you to evacuate all passengers to the forward section of the aircraft. If I make a mistake with this disarmament procedure, the electromagnetic pulse could still be dangerous to anyone within 30 feet of the device." The federal agent immediately began coordinating the passenger evacuation, his 15 years of experience allowing him to maintain order even as the civilian travelers realized they were being moved away from what was essentially a sophisticated bomb. Nicole Foster, the nurse who had defended Kat earlier, helped calm the more frightened passengers while keeping them organized and cooperative. "Is she really going to be able to disarm that thing?" Nicole asked Agent Quinn quietly as they supervised the evacuation. "Ma'am," Quinn replied, watching Kat work with instruments that looked like they belonged in a NASA laboratory rather than a terrorist weapon. "I've been in federal law enforcement for 15 years, and I've never seen anyone operate at Lieutenant Reeves level. If anyone can neutralize that device safely, it's her." Through the aircraft's communication system, Captain Mitchell provided updates on Air Force One's status. "Lieutenant, I'm receiving confirmation that the President's aircraft has safely entered European airspace under heavy fighter escort. Whatever that weapon was supposed to do, the window for its effective use has passed." But Kat's response was grim as she examined the weapon's internal programming. "Captain, this device wasn't just designed to attack Air Force One during approach. It has multiple target profiles programmed into its guidance system. If I can't disarm it completely, it could be used against any aircraft within a 50-mile radius, including commercial flights, military transports, or emergency response helicopters." The stakes had suddenly escalated beyond protecting the president to potentially saving hundreds of innocent lives aboard other aircraft in the area. The electromagnetic weapon was essentially a flying area denial system that could bring down anything with electronic flight systems within its operational range. Working with tools that had been hidden in her clothing and personal items throughout the flight, Kat began the delicate process of disconnecting the weapon's targeting system from its power source. Each wire had to be identified through a combination of visual analysis and electronic scanning, then disconnected in a precise sequence that would prevent the activation of fail-safe systems designed to trigger immediate detonation. "Control, this is Shadow 7. The weapon system is more sophisticated than anticipated. I'm looking at programming that suggests this device was designed for multiple attack scenarios, not just the Iron Eagle operation. This might be a field test for a new class of electronic warfare weapons." Her handler's response carried the weight of implications that reached far beyond a single terrorist attack. "Shadow 7, if you're correct about this being a weapons test, then stopping this attack just became a matter of national security at the highest level. That technology cannot be allowed to fall into hostile hands under any circumstances." As Kat continued working to disarm the device, she could hear Elena Kozlov attempting to communicate with the remaining conscious terrorists through whispered conversations in what sounded like coded language. The former Spetsnaz operator was apparently trying to coordinate one final desperate attempt to complete their mission, even with most of their team captured and their primary weapon system compromised. "Elena," Kat called out without looking away from her work, "the backup activation codes you're trying to share with your associates were changed 6 hours ago when we took control of your communications network. Any attempt to use them will simply identify additional terrorist cells for elimination." The revelation that Operation Silent Eagle had not only infiltrated their communications, but had actually taken control of their command and control systems, was the final blow to whatever morale remained among the captured terrorists. They had been outmaneuvered at every level, from strategic planning down to tactical execution. But even as the last of their resistance crumbled, Kat knew that disarming the electromagnetic weapon was still a race against time. The device was designed with multiple layers of security, and each system she disabled revealed another level of complexity that suggested engineering capabilities far beyond typical terrorist resources. "Almost there," she murmured, carefully disconnecting the final power coupling while monitoring the weapon's internal systems for signs of failsafe activation. "Control, electromagnetic weapon is 90% neutralized. Recommend immediate technical analysis team to examine this technology for intelligence value." The most dangerous weapon ever deployed against an American president was finally silent. But the implications of its existence would reshape military intelligence operations for years to come.
The emergency landing at Andrews Air Force Base was unlike anything in the facility's history. Flight 892 touched down on the longest runway available, surrounded by a security perimeter that included military police, hazardous material specialists, FBI counterterrorism teams, and technical analysts from agencies that officially didn't exist. As the aircraft taxied to a specially designated area away from normal air traffic, Kat could see through the small windows that they were being escorted by vehicles that belonged in a war zone rather than a civilian airport. "Ladies and gentlemen," Captain Mitchell announced over the intercom, his voice carrying the exhaustion of someone who had just lived through the most intense flight of his career, "we have safely arrived at Andrews Air Force Base. Please remain seated until federal agents board the aircraft and provide specific instructions for your departure. I want to thank you for your cooperation during what I know has been an extraordinary and frightening experience." Agent Quinn was coordinating with the federal response teams through his secure communication channel, providing real-time intelligence about the captured terrorists and the neutralized weapon system. His 15 years of experience in law enforcement had taught him to expect the unexpected, but nothing in his training had prepared him for witnessing a single operative dismantle an international conspiracy while maintaining perfect cover as a traumatized veteran. "Lieutenant Reeves," Quinn said as specialized teams began boarding the aircraft, "I've worked with some impressive agents over the years, but what you accomplished on this flight was beyond anything I thought was possible. How do operations like this normally get handled from an administrative perspective?" Kat looked at him with an expression that was equal parts professional respect and gentle amusement. "Agent Quinn, from an administrative perspective, none of this ever happened. Flight 892 experienced minor mechanical difficulties that required an emergency landing for routine safety inspections. The passengers were briefly delayed for standard security screening, and everyone went home with an interesting story about airplane maintenance procedures." The federal agent stared at her for a moment as the implications sank in. "What about the 17 terrorists we captured? What about the electromagnetic weapon? What about the attack on Air Force One?" "What terrorists?" Kat replied calmly. "What weapon? What attack?" Her smile was gentle but firm. "Agent Quinn, there are some victories that can only be celebrated in silence, and some threats that can only be neutralized in the shadows. The safety of the American people sometimes requires that heroes remain invisible and successes stay classified." As the specialized response teams began the careful process of removing the captured operatives and securing the evidence, Kat could see the civilian passengers being escorted off the aircraft by federal agents who would conduct extensive but gentle debriefings. Nicole Foster, the nurse who had defended her during Bradley's verbal attacks, looked back toward Kat with an expression of gratitude and confusion. "Will we ever see you again?" Nicole asked as she passed Kat's seat. "Ma'am," Kat replied, her voice carrying a warmth that hadn't been there during her operational mode, "you've already seen more of me than most people get to witness in a lifetime. Take care of yourself and remember that sometimes the people who seem weakest are actually the strongest of all." Through her earpiece, Kat received final updates from her handler. Shadow 7. Preliminary interrogation of captured assets has yielded intelligence on at least 12 additional terrorist cells across 6 countries. Operation Iron Eagle was apparently the first phase of a much larger campaign targeting American leadership and military infrastructure. Your work on Flight 892 has potentially prevented dozens of future attacks. But even as the broader implications of the conspiracy were being analyzed, Kat's immediate mission was entering its final phase. Dmitry Volkov,
Yelena Kozlov, and the other captured operatives were being transferred to facilities where they would be questioned extensively about their training, their support networks, and their knowledge of other planned operations. The electromagnetic weapon was being carefully transported to a secure facility where technical specialists would reverse engineer its capabilities and develop countermeasures. Dmitry, Kat said, as the Russian operative was being prepared for transfer, "You asked earlier how long we had been watching your operation. The truth is, we've been tracking Iron Eagle since before you knew you were part of it. Your recruitment, your training, your insertion into the United States, all of it was monitored and documented by people who specialize in finding threats before they become dangerous." The Russians' response was a mixture of professional respect and personal defeat. Katherine Reeves, you and your organization represent a level of operational sophistication that I was not prepared to encounter. I underestimated the capabilities of American intelligence services.
No, Dmitry, Kat replied with the patience of someone explaining a fundamental truth. You underestimated what happens when foreign intelligence services threaten American children. There are lines that cannot be crossed, and consequences that cannot be avoided when those lines are violated. As the last of the terrorists was removed from the aircraft, Agent Quinn remained behind to coordinate the final security sweep. His interaction with Lieutenant Katherine Reeves had fundamentally changed his understanding of what was possible in the realm of national security and intelligence operations. "Lieutenant," Quinn said as the technical teams finished their examination of the cargo hold, "can I ask you something off the record?" "Agent Quinn, as far as official records are concerned, we never met. But personally, I'd be happy to answer any questions you might have about what you witnessed today." How many other operations like this are happening right now? How many other threats are being neutralized by people like you that the public never hears about? Kat considered her response carefully, weighing operational security against the respect she had developed for the federal agent who had helped protect civilian lives during the crisis. "Agent Quinn, every day that Americans wake up safe in their beds, go to work without fear of attack, and send their children to school confident in their security, they owe that peace to people who work in the shadows. There are threats that never materialize because they're stopped before anyone knows they existed." She stood and gathered her personal items, preparing to leave Flight 892 for what would probably be the last time. The crying woman in seat 22C was just one small part of a much larger system dedicated to ensuring that freedom survives in a dangerous world. Most Americans will never know how many times they've been protected, and that's exactly how it should be. Through the aircraft's windows, she could see military vehicles transporting the captured terrorists to secure facilities where they would provide intelligence about other planned attacks. The electromagnetic weapon was being loaded onto a specialized transport that would take it to laboratories where the most brilliant technical minds in the country would analyze its capabilities and develop countermeasures. But perhaps most importantly, she could see Air Force One landing safely at a military base in Germany, carrying the president and his daughter to their scheduled summit, completely unaware of how close they had come to assassination. The mission had been successful not because it had eliminated a threat dramatically, but because it had prevented a tragedy so completely that it would never be recorded in any history book. "Agent Quinn," Kat said as she prepared to leave the aircraft, "when you file your report on today's events, I want you to emphasize something for your supervisors. The passengers who mocked a crying veteran spent 2 hours unknowingly being protected by someone who would have died before letting them be harmed. That's not irony. That's patriotism." As Lieutenant Katherine Reeves walked off Flight 892 for the last time, she carried with her the satisfaction of knowing that 17 international terrorists would never threaten American lives again, that a sophisticated weapons system had been captured and analyzed,
and that the president's 12-year-old daughter would grow up safely because of work that would never be officially acknowledged. The broken veteran in seat 22C had disappeared forever, but her legacy would be measured in lives saved and freedoms preserved. In the world of shadows where Operation Silent Eagle operated, there was no higher honor than invisible success and unrecognized sacrifice. The mission was complete, and America was safer because of it.
6 months after Flight 892's emergency landing at Andrews Air Force Base, Katherine Reeves sat in a small cafe in downtown Seattle, wearing civilian clothes and reading a newspaper like any other professional on her lunch break. To the casual observer, she was just another government contractor grabbing coffee between meetings, perhaps working for one of the many defense companies that populated the Pacific Northwest. No one would have suspected that she was one of the most classified operatives in the world, or that the seemingly ordinary newspaper in her hands contained coded intelligence about her next mission. The headline on the front page read, "Commercial aviation security reaches all-time high following new protocols." Below it, a smaller article announced, "International cooperation leads to disruption of major terrorist networks." The public would never know that both stories were direct results of what had happened aboard Flight 892, but Katherine took quiet satisfaction in knowing that air travel was safer because of intelligence gathered during those terrifying hours at 30,000 feet. Her phone buzzed with a text message from an unknown number, but she recognized the pattern immediately. A former passenger from Flight 892 was in Seattle and wanted to meet. Katherine felt her pulse quicken as she realized who it had to be. Nicole Foster, the nurse who had defended her during Bradley Hartman's verbal attacks, was in town for a medical conference. 20 minutes later, Katherine walked into the lobby of the Fairmont Olympic Hotel and spotted Nicole immediately. The nurse was wearing professional attire and carried herself with the confident bearing of someone who had been profoundly changed by her experiences 6 months earlier. When she saw Katherine, her face lit up with genuine joy, mixed with something that looked like relief. "I wasn't sure you'd come," Nicole said as they found a quiet corner of the hotel lounge. "I've been thinking about you constantly since that flight, wondering if I'd ever get the chance to properly thank you for what you did." Katherine studied her former fellow passenger with the analytical eye that never completely switched off, even in social situations. "How have you been, Nicole? I know that what happened on Flight 892 was traumatic for everyone involved." "Traumatic?" Cole laughed, but there was no humor in the sound. "Katherine, what happened on that flight was the most important experience of my life. Do you know how many times I've thought about the fact that I spent 2 hours watching someone mock and abuse the person who was literally saving our lives?" The nurse leaned forward, her voice dropping to a whisper despite the privacy of their location. "I've been working with a veterans support group in Phoenix since that flight. Every time I meet someone who's struggling with the transition back to civilian life, I think about how wrong we were about you, how completely and totally wrong." Katherine felt that familiar surge of emotion that she had learned to associate with connections that went beyond operational necessities. Her time on Flight 892 had taught her something about the value of genuine human relationships that no amount of training could have provided. "Nicole, I want you to understand something," Katherine said carefully. "The person you defended on that airplane, the woman who was crying in seat 22C, that was real, too. The grief, the pain, the sense of loss, all of that was authentic. The only difference was that I had learned to use those emotions as tools for a larger purpose." Nicole's eyes widened as she processed this revelation. "You mean you really had lost people? The photograph, the tears, the emotional breakdown, that wasn't all an act?" "My teammates died 6 months before Flight 892, Katherine replied, her voice carrying the weight of genuine loss. 3 of the best soldiers I've ever served with, killed during a classified operation that officially never happened. Their sacrifice led to the intelligence that put me on your plane." The confession hung between them like a bridge connecting 2 very different worlds. Nicole represented the civilian life that Katherine protected, but could never fully be part of, while Katherine embodied the sacrifices that made Nicole's peaceful existence possible. "Katherine," Nicole said quietly, "do you ever think about what would have happened if you had actually just been a traumatized veteran having a breakdown? What if there had been no hidden mission, no terrorist conspiracy, no secret weapon?"
Katherine considered the question seriously. It was something she had thought about during quiet moments over the past 6 months, usually in the early hours of the morning when sleep proved elusive and her mind wandered to alternative possibilities. "I think about that more than you might expect," she admitted. "I think about how easy it was for people to dismiss someone's pain, to mock vulnerability, to assume that strength only looks one way. The passengers who attacked me that day weren't evil people. They were just limited in their understanding of what trauma looks like."
Nicole nodded, her expression thoughtful. "I've seen that same attitude in hospitals with patients who don't fit the expected profile of what suffering is supposed to look like. People assume that strength means being stoic, that real heroes don't cry or show fear. But here's what I learned on Flight 892, Katherine continued. Sometimes the most courageous thing you can do is allow yourself to be vulnerable in front of people who might not understand. The tears I cried were real, even though they were also part of my cover. The grief I displayed was authentic, even though I was using it to gather intelligence." Their conversation was interrupted by Katherine's phone buzzing with what appeared to be a routine text message, but she recognized the coded language immediately. Another mission, another threat that needed to be neutralized before it could endanger innocent lives. The work never ended, but now she carried something with her that made the sacrifices more meaningful. "I have to go," Katherine said, standing with the fluid grace that marked her as something more than an ordinary government contractor. "But Nicole, I want you to know something. What you did on that airplane, defending someone you thought was defenseless, that took more courage than anything I did operationally." Nicole stood as well, extending her hand in what started as a formal goodbye but turned into a warm embrace. "Stay safe, Katherine. Whatever you're doing up there, wherever you're going, remember that you have friends who care about you." As Katherine walked through the streets of Seattle toward her next assignment, she carried with her the knowledge that her work had personal meaning beyond national security imperatives. The passengers from Flight 892 were living safer lives because she had been there, and the veterans she encountered in her future operations would benefit from the understanding she had gained about the complexity of strength and vulnerability. Her phone buzzed again with mission details that would take her to another city, another identity, another chance to protect people who would never know they had been saved. But now she understood something that her training had never taught her. The most important victories weren't the ones that made headlines or earned medals, but the quiet moments of human connection that reminded her why the work mattered. The broken veteran in seat 22C had been real, and so had the elite operative who saved Air Force One. Both were part of Katherine Reeves, and both were necessary for the mission that would continue as long as there were threats to innocent lives and people willing to stand between darkness and light. As she boarded another flight bound for another assignment, Katherine allowed herself a small smile. Somewhere above the clouds, Air Force One continued to carry the president safely to destinations around the world, protected by security measures that had been enhanced because of intelligence gathered during those crucial hours aboard Flight 892. The tears had been real, the mission had been successful, and the transformation was complete. Katherine Reeves had learned to be both vulnerable and strong, both human and operational, both broken and whole. In the end, that was what made her the most dangerous woman in any room she entered, not just her training or her capabilities, but her understanding that true strength came from protecting others, even when they couldn't see the threats that surrounded them. The ghost had learned to be human, and in doing so, had become something far more powerful than either identity could achieve alone. Up next, you've got two more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out. And don't forget to subscribe and turn on the notification bell so you don't miss any upload from us.